Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Appalachia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1923. Spring had finally broken through the harsh winter that had gripped McDowell County, West Virginia. The dogwoods were in bloom, painting white patches against the deep green of the Appalachian slopes. To most, this signaled renewal, the promise of warmer days. But in the small coal mining community of Welch, nestled between steep mountain ridges, spring would bring only darkness. March 17th, a date that would eventually be redacted from local newspapers, the day the Harper brothers vanished from public record. What makes this case particularly disturbing isn't just the disappearance itself, but the systematic erasure that followed. County records altered, newspaper archives mysteriously damaged by water leaks, witness testimonies contradicting each other so severely that investigators simply closed the file. Some say it began with the discovery of an abandoned Ford Model T found on the old logging road that winds up toward Bear Creek. Others claim it started years earlier with the arrival of the Harper family to the region in 1908. But official documentation, what little remains, begins with a telegraph sent from the Welch Police Department to authorities in Charleston. Request assistance. Situation at Harper property requires immediate attention. Nature of incident unclear. The telegraph was never answered, at least not officially. What happened to Elias and Jeremiah Harper? Why were their names methodically removed from census records? And why, in 1962, did three historical researchers from Marshall University abandon their investigation after accessing sealed documents in the state archives? This is not a ghost story. There are no curses or supernatural elements to what transpired in those mountains. What happened was entirely human, and perhaps that's what makes it truly terrifying. The Harper brothers operated a small lumber mill approximately 7 miles outside of Welch proper. Their operation wasn't large, nothing like the massive coal companies that dominated the region, but it provided steady work for about 15 local men. The mill sat on Harper land, nearly 40 acres of densely wooded property that had been in the family since before the Civil War. According to land deeds from 1907, Elias Harper, the elder of the brothers at 32, had inherited the property from his father, Thomas Harper. Jeremiah, 4 years younger, was listed as co-owner, though several business documents suggest Elias maintained primary control of operations. The brothers were known locally as hard-working private men who rarely participated in community gatherings. Descriptions of the brothers come primarily from interviews conducted by Dr. Margaret Weller in 1949 as part of an oral history project on industrial development in southern West Virginia. Those interviews, later removed from Marshall University's archives, described Elias as tall, broad-shouldered, with a full beard, always neatly trimmed. Jeremiah was leaner, clean-shaven except for a mustache, with eyes that seemed to be looking at something behind you. Neither brother ever married. They lived together in the family home, a 2-story structure built of local timber that stood approximately half a mile from the mill itself. The house was positioned on a small rise, offering a view of the operation below and the winding dirt road that connected their property to the main highway. What's particularly noteworthy is that despite being prominent business owners, the Harpers appear in very few photographs. A single image, preserved in a 1919 business directory, shows them standing stiffly before the mill. Both wear dark suits despite the working environment. Neither is smiling. The brothers were last seen on March 16, 1923. According to statements from mill workers, operations proceeded normally that day. The spring thaw had increased their workload, with timber being brought down from higher elevations now that the snow had receded. Elias spent most of the day in the small office adjoining the sawmill while Jeremiah oversaw the cutting floor. At approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, Elias emerged from the office and announced that operations would cease for the day. This was unusual. The mill typically ran until sundown, especially during busy periods. Even more unusual was his instruction that workers should not report the following day, a Saturday, when overtime work was standard practice. William Daniels, who operated the main saw, would later tell investigators, "Mr. Elias seemed different that afternoon, not agitated exactly, more like someone who'd made a decision after a long time thinking on it. He paid us all in cash right there, full day's wage plus $1 extra, said we should take the weekend, enjoy it with our families." That night, a storm moved through the region. Heavy rain, unseasonable for mid-March. The dirt roads turned to mud, effectively isolating the more remote properties until conditions improved. No one attempted to reach the Harper mill until Monday morning, March 19th. What the workers found or didn't find is where this story truly begins. The mill stood silent. The massive boiler that powered the operation was cold, something unheard of during operational months, as maintaining steam was a day-long process. The office door was locked, the windows of the Harper house shuttered, despite the clear morning. Most notably, the brothers' automobile was missing. James Whitaker, the mill foreman, used his emergency key to access the office. He found nothing unusual inside. Ledgers neatly stacked, the day's receipts properly filed. The safe containing payroll for the coming week was securely locked. Nothing suggested a hasty departure or any kind of disturbance. It was only when workers walked to the main house that the first troubling signs appeared. The front door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the house was immaculate, almost unnaturally so. Beds made with hospital corners, dishes cleaned and stacked, floors recently swept. As one worker put it, it looked like a house in a catalog, not a place where people actually lived. Foreman Whitaker immediately contacted the local sheriff's office. Deputy Samuel Hayes arrived by midday, conducted a brief inspection, and declared there was nothing to investigate. His report, one of the few documents that survived the subsequent purge, stated only that the Harper brothers appeared to have left their property of their own accord. No signs of struggle or criminal activity observed. What Deputy Hayes failed to note, or chose not to record, were several details that local workers found disturbing. The brothers' personal effects remained in the house. Clothing hung in wardrobes. Elias's reading glasses sat on his bedside table, alongside a book open to the middle. Jeremiah's prized pocket watch, a gift from their father, rested on his bureau. The family Bible, containing generations of Harper history, remained in its place of honor in the sitting room. These were not the signs of men planning a journey. For 3 days, operations at the mill remained suspended. Then, on March 22nd, a telegram arrived from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Addressed to James Whitaker, it contained brief instructions: resume operations, business sold, new ownership arriving April 1st, continue as normal. E. Harper. The telegram raised more questions than it answered. The Harper brothers had never mentioned plans to sell. The business was profitable, especially with post-war construction creating high demand for lumber. Most concerning to those who knew them, the Harpers were deeply connected to their ancestral land. The property had been in the family for generations. Selling seemed unthinkable. Nevertheless, operations resumed, and on April 1st, as promised, representatives from the newly formed Allegheny Timber Company arrived to take possession of the mill. The transaction appeared legitimate. Proper documentation was filed with the county, transfer of ownership recorded, workers retained under new contracts. What happened to the Harper brothers? The official record is silent. No further communications were received. No sightings reported in Pittsburgh or elsewhere. Their automobile, a black Model T with distinctive brass fittings, was never located. For all practical purposes, Elias and Jeremiah Harper simply ceased to exist after March 16, 1923. The case might have faded into obscurity, remembered only as local lore, had it not been for what happened in the autumn of that same year. October 27, 1923. A hunting party from Charleston, tracking deer in the remote forests approximately 12 miles northwest of the Harper property, made a disturbing discovery. In a steep ravine, hidden beneath a tangle of mountain laurel, they found an abandoned automobile. The vehicle had clearly been there for months, partially reclaimed by the forest. Vines grew through the broken windows. Animals had nested in the seats. It was a black Ford Model T with distinctive brass fittings. The hunters reported their discovery to local authorities. Sheriff Robert Thornton, who had replaced the previous sheriff following a sudden resignation in July, personally led a search of the area. No bodies were found, no blood evidence, nothing to suggest what might have happened to the vehicle's occupants. The automobile was towed to the county impound, where it was positively identified as belonging to the Harper brothers. This discovery should have prompted a full investigation. It did not. Instead, within days, official communications began referring to the matter as resolved. The automobile was released from impound to a representative of Allegheny Timber, who promptly had it transported out of the county. The ravine where it was discovered was declared off-limits due to unsafe mining conditions, despite no active or historical mining in that specific area. Most disturbing of all, when the Charleston Gazette attempted to publish an article about the discovery, the story was pulled just before printing. The newspaper's editor would later claim he received a late-night phone call from someone claiming to represent the governor's office, advising that the story contained factual inaccuracies and should be withheld pending review. That review never occurred. The story never ran. By the end of 1923, the Harper brothers had been effectively erased from public record. Their names no longer appeared in business directories. The 1920 census records for McDowell County show curious omissions exactly where the Harper household should be listed. Even church records from the Methodist congregation in Welch, where both brothers were members, if not regular attendees, show their names crossed out, with a notation simply reading relocated. The community's silence was perhaps the most telling aspect of all. Former mill workers, when approached by outsiders asking about the previous owners, would quickly change the subject. Local merchants who had done business with the brothers for years would claim poor memory when their names were mentioned. It was as if an unspoken agreement had formed. The Harper brothers were not to be discussed. This conspicuous silence persisted for decades. The mill continued operations under Allegheny Timber until 1951, when declining demand led to its closure. The Harper house stood vacant, falling into disrepair until it was finally demolished in 1959 to make way for a new county road that, curiously, was never completed. The story might have ended there, just another rural mystery lost to time, had it not been for the academic interest of Dr. Margaret Weller. In 1949, as mentioned earlier, Dr. Weller conducted a series of interviews for her industrial development project. Several of these interviews tangentially touched on the Harper lumber operation, though transcripts show subjects quickly steering conversations toward other topics when pressed for details. One interview, however, yielded unexpected information. Martha Collins had worked as a housekeeper for several prominent families in Welch during the 1920s, including occasionally cleaning for the county sheriff's office. Now elderly and living in a nursing home in Bluefield, she spoke freely to Dr. Weller about many aspects of life in McDowell County during that era. When the Harper name arose, unlike others, she didn't deflect. Those poor men, the transcript records her saying, what was done to them wasn't right, but what they'd done wasn't right either. Sometimes there's no justice that fits. When pressed for clarification, Collins became evasive, claiming her memory wasn't reliable. But she added one cryptic statement that would later prove significant. If you want to know the truth, you should look at what's buried under the new floor. This statement made little sense to Dr. Weller at the time. Her research was focused on economic development, not local mysteries. She noted the comment, but didn't pursue it further. Her interview recordings and transcripts were archived at Marshall University, where they remained largely untouched for over a decade. In 1962, three graduate students from Marshall's History Department, James Harlow, Patricia Denning, and Robert Kellerman, stumbled across Dr. Weller's materials while researching Appalachian industrial development. The Harper case, with its curious omissions and contradictions, captured their interest. What began as academic curiosity soon evolved into a dedicated investigation. Over several months, the students pieced together the fragmentary evidence surrounding the Harper brothers' disappearance. They located surviving mill workers, now elderly men. They examined property records and business filings. Most significantly, they petitioned for access to sealed county records from the period, a request surprisingly granted after initial resistance. What they discovered has never been fully revealed. What we do know is this. After 3 days of examining documents in the state archives in Charleston, the students abruptly abandoned their research. Harlow and Denning withdrew from their graduate programs entirely. Kellerman continued his studies, but switched his focus to medieval European history, about as far from Appalachian studies as one could get. When approached years later by another researcher interested in the case, Kellerman's response was blunt. Some things should stay buried, for everyone's sake. The students' research notes, if they existed, were never found. Their faculty advisor, Dr. William Chambers, when questioned about the abrupt end to the project, would only say that the students had encountered methodological problems and chosen to pursue other areas of study. When pressed, he terminated the interview. This brings us to 1968, when a construction project would inadvertently shed new light on the decades-old mystery. The former Harper property, by then owned by the county and largely reclaimed by forest, was being partially cleared for a planned recreational area. During excavation of the mill site, workers made a discovery that brought operations to an immediate halt. Beneath the concrete floor of what had once been the mill's boiler room, workers uncovered a sealed chamber approximately 10 feet square. This space did not appear in any of the building's original plans. Its walls were lined with a double layer of brick, an unusual construction method for the region. Most disturbing was what the chamber contained: nothing. The space was entirely empty, clinically so. The floor had been scrubbed clean, then sealed with a substance later identified as a industrial-grade epoxy not commonly available in the 1920s. The walls showed evidence of having been treated with chemicals that prevented any organic material from leaving traces. In short, it was a room designed for one purpose: to ensure that whatever happened inside it left no evidence. County officials quickly cordoned off the area. The discovery was not reported in local newspapers. Workers were instructed not to discuss what they'd found. Within days, the excavation was filled in, the recreational area project quietly abandoned. The land was redesignated as a watershed protection zone, prohibiting future development. One worker, however, spoke anonymously to a reporter from the Bluefield Daily Telegraph. His account, recorded but never published, described something officials had apparently removed before sealing the site: a metal strongbox approximately 2 feet long, recovered from a small cavity beneath the chamber floor. The contents of that box, if it indeed existed, remain unknown. No official record acknowledges its discovery. No inventory of its contents was ever filed. Like so much else in this case, it vanishes from the historical record almost immediately after appearing. But perhaps it contained the answer to Martha Collins's cryptic statement from years earlier. Look at what's buried under the new floor. What happened to the Harper brothers in March 1923? The official record provides no answers, but by assembling fragmentary evidence, examining what was deliberately erased, and studying the conspicuous silences, a disturbing picture begins to emerge. The lumber mill operated by the Harper brothers was, by all accounts, a legitimate business. Their timber harvesting practices, while aggressive by modern standards, were typical for the era. Financial records show consistent profitability, with no evidence of debt or financial impropriety. Tax filings, though incomplete, suggest compliance with relevant laws, Yet something changed in the months leading up to their disappearance. Bank records from late 1922 show unusual patterns, large withdrawals made by Elias Harper, often followed by extended absences from the mill. Jeremiah making inquiries about steamship passages to South America. Most telling, the brothers' quiet acquisition of over 200 acres of remote forest land northwest of their existing property, land that had little commercial value but offered almost complete isolation. Then there were the modifications to the mill itself. In January 1923, the brothers hired construction workers from outside the county to make what were described as modernizations to the boiler room. Workers were paid well above standard rates, and all were dismissed once the concrete floor was poured. No local workers were permitted to observe the construction. These actions suggest preparation. For what, we can only speculate. A possible answer comes from one of the few witnesses who ever spoke openly about the case. Harold Mercer, who delivered mail along the rural route that included the Harper property, gave a statement to investigators in 1962 that was promptly sealed. In 1968, nearing the end of his life and suffering from terminal illness, Mercer agreed to an interview with a local historian under condition of anonymity until after his death. According to Mercer, in the weeks before their disappearance, he delivered several packages to the Harper brothers. The packages, unlike their usual business correspondence, came from medical supply companies in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Most troubling was Mercer's observation that one package had broken open during transit, revealing glass vials and surgical instruments. "I asked Mr. Elias what they were getting into," Mercer recalled. "He just stared at me for the longest time, then said they were advancing the understanding of man. I didn't like how he said it. There was something wrong in his voice." Mercer also reported that in early March, just weeks before the disappearance, he observed unusual activity at the Harper house late at night. Through partially open curtains, he glimpsed what appeared to be a medical examination taking place in the dining room, which had been cleared of furniture and draped with white sheets. He couldn't identify the subject of this examination, but noted that both brothers were wearing what looked like surgical aprons. "I didn't report it," Mercer admitted. "Maybe I should have, but the Harpers were respected men. And in these mountains, folks mind their own business if they know what's good for them." These observations, disturbing as they are, align with rumors that circulated quietly among certain segments of the community. Rumors suggesting the Harper brothers had developed interests that went beyond lumber harvesting. Interests in human anatomy, in surgical techniques, in experiments that no reputable medical institution would sanction. But if the brothers were engaged in such activities, who were their subjects? The most troubling aspect of this case is that no disappearances were reported in McDowell County during this period, no missing persons, no unexplained absences. Every resident, every worker, every traveler passing through seems accounted for in various records. This apparent contradiction, evidence of possible wrongdoing but no evident victims, represents perhaps the most disturbing element of the Harper mystery. It suggests either remarkable discretion in victim selection or, more terrifying still, complicity from officials who might have ensured certain disappearances went unrecorded. What happened on March 16, 1923, the day the Harper brothers instructed workers to take an unexpected weekend off? The day before they vanished? One theory, supported by fragmentary evidence, suggests the brothers fell victim to their own activities, that whatever procedures they were conducting in secret went catastrophically wrong, that perhaps they became their own final subjects. This theory is supported by an entry in the private journal of Dr. Samuel Westbrook, a physician in Welch who died in 1941. The journal, discovered among his effects by his daughter decades later, contains a single reference to the Harper case, consulted today by S.H., presumably Sheriff Hayes, regarding unusual case. Advised immediate containment and sanitization, some knowledge beyond reach of man not meant to be pursued. Recommended sealing of site and complete documentation blackout. God forgive us all. The entry is dated March 18, 1923, the day before workers discovered the brothers missing. If this theory is correct, it suggests that local authorities discovered something so disturbing at the Harper property that they made the unprecedented decision to erase not just evidence, but the very existence of the Harper brothers from public record, something that justified the elaborate chamber beneath the mill floor with its chemical treatments and impermeable surfaces. But what about the automobile, discovered months later, miles from the property? This detail suggests flight rather than a fatal incident on the property itself. Perhaps one or both brothers survived whatever transpired that night. Perhaps they attempted to escape from their own actions, from justice, or from something else entirely. The discovery of the vehicle in a remote ravine with no bodies nearby offers one final chilling possibility, that whatever the Harpers had been exploring, whatever knowledge they had been pursuing, it changed them in ways that made them no longer recognizable as the men they had been, that perhaps they walked away from that ravine as something else entirely. This interpretation veers dangerously close to the supernatural, territory we've explicitly avoided in this account. But consider the possibility in purely scientific terms, that the brothers' experiments, whatever their nature, resulted in psychological changes profound enough to alter their very identities, that they abandoned their vehicle and continued on foot, perhaps to the remote land they'd recently acquired, as fundamentally different people than those who had entered the forest. The truth likely lies somewhere in the fragmentary evidence that survived the systematic erasure. In the sealed records that 3 graduate students accessed in 1962, only to abandon their research immediately afterward. In the contents of a metal strongbox reportedly recovered from beneath the mill floor in 1968, then promptly disappeared into official custody. What remains clear is that something happened in those Appalachian mountains, something entirely human yet profoundly disturbing, something that multiple officials across decades deemed too troubling for public knowledge. The Harper brothers' story represents a peculiar form of horror, not the supernatural kind that one can dismiss as mere fantasy, but the kind that emerges from human curiosity unconstrained by ethics or empathy, from the drive to know, to discover, to transcend limitations, regardless of cost. In 1969, the last physical remnant of the Harper brothers was quietly removed from public access. Their parents' headstones in the Welch Cemetery, which had included inscriptions acknowledging their sons, were replaced with new markers omitting any reference to Elias or Jeremiah. The replacement occurred overnight, with no paperwork filed. When questioned, cemetery officials claimed the original stones had been damaged by vandals. Today, nothing remains to suggest the Harper brothers ever existed. Their property has been reclaimed by forest. The mill foundations have crumbled into the earth. County records from the period remain sealed under an obscure statute related to public health matters of historical significance. Yet their story persists in the cultural memory of the region, not as explicit history, but in the peculiar silences that fall when certain topics arise, in the wariness older residents still show toward isolated properties, in the advice still given to children, don't wander too far into the woods, especially near the old Harper land, because some things, once started, cannot truly be stopped. Some knowledge, once gained, cannot be forgotten. It can be buried, sealed away, erased from official record, but it leaves impressions, echoes, ripples that continue long after the original disturbance has been obscured. In 1962, Robert Kellerman, one of the 3 students who abandoned their research after accessing sealed records, wrote a letter to his faculty advisor before leaving the university. Only a fragment of this letter survives, preserved among Dr. Chambers' personal papers, donated to the university archives after his death. What troubles me most is not what they did, though God knows that's horror enough. It's that somewhere in those mountains their work might continue. That knowledge like that, once discovered, creates its own momentum. I'll never go back to West Virginia. I'll never speak of what we found. But sometimes, late at night, I find myself listening for sounds that human throats shouldn't make. The Harper brothers vanished in 1923. Their names were methodically erased from public record. Their story survives only in fragments, in whispers, in the conspicuous silences of official documentation. But perhaps somewhere in those Appalachian mountains, in some remote hollow or hidden structure, evidence remains. Perhaps someday someone will discover the full truth of what Elias and Jeremiah Harper were pursuing in those final months before their disappearance, what knowledge they sought, what boundaries they crossed. For now, their story serves as a reminder that the most profound horrors are not ghostly apparitions or supernatural entities, but the darkness that can emerge from the human mind when it pursues knowledge without restraint. When curiosity becomes obsession, when the desire to know overshadows all ethical considerations. The Harper brothers disappeared from public record. But some legacies cannot be so easily erased. And in the deep forests of Appalachia, some say, if you listen carefully on certain nights, you can hear sounds that might be the wind through the trees, or might be something else entirely, something trying to form words with organs never meant for human speech. Perhaps it's just mountain lore. Perhaps it's just the wind. Perhaps some questions are better left unasked. But one question remains paramount in this disturbing case. What exactly were the Harper brothers investigating in those final months of 1922 and early 1923? The answer may lie in a curious document recovered during the 1962 investigation, a partially burned ledger page found in the remains of an old stove at the Methodist Church in Welch. The document, apparently torn from one of Elias Harper's personal journals, contains fragmentary notes that suggest a disturbing line of inquiry. While much of the page was damaged by fire, certain phrases remain legible. Tissue regeneration accelerated beyond expectation. Nervous system adaptation to foreign material. And most troublingly, consciousness transfer remains theoretical but promising. These phrases suggest research of an advanced medical nature, far beyond what would be expected from lumber mill operators in rural West Virginia in the 1920s. Where did the Harper brothers acquire such knowledge? What formal training did they possess? Records indicate that Elias Harper attended medical school at Johns Hopkins University from 1908 to 1910, but withdrew before completing his degree. Jeremiah had no formal medical training, though he did serve briefly as a medical orderly during World War I. These backgrounds, while suggestive, hardly explain the apparently sophisticated nature of their later interests. One possibility emerges from a detail previously overlooked in county records. In 1919, the Harper brothers provided lumber at a significant discount to a sanitarium being constructed near Beckley, approximately 40 miles from Welch. The Glenwood Sanitarium, as it was called, operated until 1925, ostensibly as a treatment facility for respiratory ailments common among coal miners. However, rumors persisted that Glenwood served another purpose entirely. Several accounts suggest it functioned as an unofficial research facility where experimental treatments were tested on patients with little oversight or documentation. More concerning still, records indicate that Elias Harper made regular trips to Glenwood throughout 1920 and 1921, often staying for several days at a time. Did the Harper brothers forge connections with medical researchers at Glenwood? Did they gain access to unorthodox knowledge or techniques? The records that might answer these questions have vanished, along with the sanitarium itself, which burned to the ground in 1925 under circumstances that were never fully explained. Whatever insights the brothers gained during this period, they seem to have devoted increasing resources to their own private research. Beginning in late 1921, financial records show substantial expenditures for equipment and materials not related to lumber production. These purchases accelerated throughout 1922, culminating in the modifications to the mill's boiler room in January 1923. But what about Martha Collins's cryptic reference to What's buried under the new floor? The sealed chamber discovered in 1968 was empty. The metal strongbox reportedly recovered from beneath it has never been officially acknowledged. What could have been hidden there that warranted such elaborate concealment? One answer may lie in a series of telegrams exchanged between Sheriff Hayes and state officials in the days following the Harper brothers' disappearance. These telegrams, preserved only because they were misfiled in records related to an unrelated tax dispute, contain coded references to biological materials and containment protocols. The most revealing of these communications, dated March 20, 1923, reads, "Materials secured. Required 3 separate containers. Transportation to federal facility arranged. Local containment impossible due to nature of specimens. Recommend complete information blackout." What specimens warranted such extraordinary measures? What federal facility received them? These questions remain unanswered, though several researchers have noted curious similarities between the Harper case and a classified government program that reportedly investigated experimental medical procedures during the interwar period. The program, codenamed Prometheus Protocol, supposedly operated from 1918 to 1926 under the auspices of the War Department's Chemical Warfare Service. While officially focused on treating injuries sustained from chemical weapons, rumors suggest researchers pursued more ambitious goals: advanced surgical techniques, experimental organ transplantation, and even attempts at preserving human consciousness after bodily death. No official acknowledgement of this program exists. References appear only in private correspondence and oral histories from individuals claiming involvement. Yet the timeline aligns suggestively with the Harper case, raising disturbing possibilities about what the brothers might have discovered or what they might have created. Another theory emerges from reports of unusual wildlife sightings in McDowell County during the months following the Harper brothers' disappearance. Local hunters reported encountering unnatural animals in the forests north of Welch, creatures that seemed somehow wrong, as if assembled from mismatched parts. These accounts were dismissed as hunting tales or moonshine-induced hallucinations, yet they persisted well into 1924. One account, recorded by a game warden in August 1923, describes encountering what appeared to be a deer with unusual appendages and eyes that seemed unnervingly aware. The warden, a man with decades of experience in the Appalachian forests, was so disturbed by the encounter that he requested transfer to another district. His request was granted with unusual speed. Could the Harper brothers have been experimenting with animal subjects before whatever final experiment led to their disappearance? This would explain the apparent absence of human victims while aligning with their interest in tissue regeneration and nervous system adaptation. But what about their ultimate fate? The abandoned automobile suggests flight, yet no trace of the brothers was ever found. No bodies, no subsequent sightings, no communication from distant locations. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist, unless, of course, they continued to exist in some form we fail to recognize. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing possibility of all, that the Harper brothers' experiments succeeded in ways that transformed them beyond recognition. That whatever they were pursuing, tissue regeneration, nervous system adaptation, consciousness transfer, ultimately changed them so profoundly that they could no longer move through the world as the men they had been. Consider the wording in Dr. Westbrook's journal entry, "Some knowledge beyond reach of man, not meant to be pursued." The emphasis on man is curious. Does it suggest the brothers had somehow transcended or descended beyond what we recognize as human? This possibility aligns with a curious detail from the search conducted around the abandoned automobile in October 1923. While official reports state that no traces of the brothers were found, one member of the search party, a local tracker named Isaiah Miller, reportedly refused to continue the search after discovering unusual tracks leading away from the ravine. According to accounts from other members of the party, Miller became visibly disturbed after examining these tracks, declaring that whatever made those marks ain't men no more. When pressed for clarification, he allegedly replied, "They're walking on more than two legs now." Miller's statement was dismissed by authorities and omitted from official reports. He himself refused to discuss the matter further, even with close family members. Within 6 months, he had sold his property and relocated to Ohio, never to return to West Virginia. What tracks did Miller discover? What did they suggest about the fate of the Harper brothers? These questions remain unanswerable based on available evidence. Yet they point toward a possibility that aligns with the brothers' apparent research interests, that their final experiment involved a transformation so profound, so fundamentally altering, that they could no longer exist within human society. This theory that the Harper brothers somehow transformed themselves through their experiments might explain the extraordinary measures taken to erase their existence from public record. Not to cover up their disappearance or presumed death, but to prevent any investigation that might reveal what they had become. It might also explain why authorities sealed off the remote land the brothers had acquired shortly before their disappearance, land that remains restricted to this day under environmental protection statutes that seem suspiciously broad in their wording and enforcement. In 1956, a geological survey team attempted to access this area as part of a statewide resource mapping project. Their request was denied without explanation. When one team member entered the restricted zone anyway, he was promptly arrested by state police and held for 3 days without formal charges. Upon release, he discovered he had been terminated from the survey project. No official record of his detention exists. What remains in those remote forests that warranted such extraordinary protection decades after the Harper brothers' disappearance? What legacy of their work persists that authorities deem too dangerous for public knowledge? Perhaps the most chilling suggestion comes from a report filed by a forest ranger in 1948 describing an encounter while patrolling the boundaries of the restricted area. The ranger, a veteran named Michael Donovan, reported hearing unusual vocalizations from deep within the forest, sounds that he initially took for injured wildlife, but gradually recognized as attempts at human speech. "The sounds had a quality I can't adequately describe," Donovan wrote, "like someone trying to form words with a mouth not designed for speaking. There was intelligence behind it, I'm certain of that, but whatever was making those sounds wasn't fully human. Not anymore." Donovan requested reassignment the following day. His report was classified and only came to light during the brief 1962 investigation. The ranger himself refused all requests for interviews until his death in 1971. Was Donovan describing an encounter with what remained of the Harper brothers? Had they somehow survived in some altered form for decades after their official disappearance? The possibility seems fantastical, yet it aligns with the fragmentary evidence of their research interests: tissue regeneration, nervous system adaptation, consciousness, transfer. If the brothers had indeed discovered methods to extend life through unorthodox means, through modifications that rendered them no longer recognizably human, it would explain the extraordinary efforts to contain both their physical remains and all knowledge of their work. This theory gained unexpected support in 1967, when a hunter who had illegally entered the restricted area returned with a disturbing trophy, a preserved hand unlike any known species. The appendage had an opposable thumb and 5 fingers, but the proportions were wrong, elongated, with joints that bent in unusual directions. The skin had a leathery quality that suggested preservation or transformation rather than decay. When authorities learned of the specimen, they confiscated it immediately. The hunter was briefly detained, then released, with a substantial fine for trespassing. He maintained until his death that what he had found was a human hand that had turned into something else. The analysis of the specimen was supposedly conducted at a research facility in Maryland, but no results were ever released publicly. According to a laboratory technician who spoke anonymously years later, the specimen displayed biological anomalies inconsistent with known evolutionary processes. More specifically, the tissue showed evidence of multiple DNA profiles somehow integrated into a cohesive structure, a feat beyond the medical capabilities of the 1960s, let alone the 1920s. What technology or knowledge could have allowed the Harper brothers to achieve such results? One possibility emerges from a curious coincidence. Thomas Harper, the brothers' father, served as a Union Army surgeon during the Civil War. Among his effects, inherited by his sons, was an extensive collection of medical texts, including several rare volumes acquired during a post-war trip to Europe. One of these volumes, mentioned in an inventory conducted after Thomas Harper's death in 1907, bears particular significance: Anatomiae Transformativa, published in Vienna in 1788. The text, attributed to a German physician known only as Dr. Friedrich, reportedly contained theories about cellular plasticity and nervous system integration, centuries ahead of conventional medical understanding. Could this obscure text have provided the theoretical framework for the Harper brothers' experiments? If so, how did they translate archaic theories into practical applications? The answer may lie in their connection to the Glenwood Sanitarium and whatever unorthodox research occurred there during the post-war period. Records indicate that among the patients at Glenwood were several veterans suffering from injuries sustained during chemical weapons attacks, men whose tissues had been altered in ways that medical science of the time could neither explain nor treat effectively. These unfortunate subjects may have provided the Harper brothers with opportunities to observe cellular plasticity firsthand, informing their later experiments. This theory gains credence from a notation in Elias Harper's partially burned ledger. GS subjects demonstrate remarkable adaptation at cellular level. Chlorine exposure creates conditions conducive to acceptance of foreign biological material. Potential applications extensive if replicated under controlled conditions. The mention of chlorine is significant. During World War I, chlorine gas was among the first chemical weapons deployed. Its effects on human tissue were devastating, causing rapid breakdown of cellular structures, particularly in the respiratory system. Could the Harper brothers have discovered that this breakdown created conditions where cellular structures became more malleable, more accepting of modification? If so, it suggests a disturbing possibility that their experiments involved deliberately recreating the effects of chemical weapons on living tissue, then attempting to guide the subsequent regeneration toward predetermined outcomes. The ethical implications are horrifying, yet aligned with the extreme measures later taken to erase all evidence of their work. But the brothers' research apparently extended beyond tissue manipulation to more ambitious goals. The phrase consciousness transfer remains theoretical but promising. From Elias's journal suggests they were pursuing the ultimate transgression, the movement of human consciousness from one biological vessel to another. Such a concept seems outlandish, yet multiple elements of the case support this interpretation. The sealed chamber beneath the mill floor, clinically clean, chemically treated to eliminate all biological traces. The 3 separate containers mentioned in Sheriff Hayes's telegram to state authorities. The specimens transported to a federal facility. Each detail suggests a procedure involving multiple subjects and the potential transfer or division of consciousness among them. Perhaps most telling is an entry from Dr. Westbrook's journal, discovered after his earlier reference to the Harper case came to light. Dated June 1923, 3 months after the brothers' disappearance, it reads, "Consulted again regarding H situation. Federal authorities seeking confirmation of theoretical framework. Reviewed materials recovered from site. Procedure appears to have followed principles outlined in Austrian text. 3-stage process. First subject preparation through chemical exposure. Second subject consciousness dissolution using electrical current. Final phase attempted integration. Evidence suggests partial success, followed by systemic rejection. God help us if they try again with refinements." This entry suggests the Harper brothers attempted something truly unprecedented: the transfer of consciousness from one prepared subject to another using techniques derived from an obscure 18th century medical text. The reference to partial success followed by systemic rejection implies their experiment achieved momentary results before failing catastrophically, one assumes, given their subsequent disappearance. But what happened to the brothers themselves during this procedure? Were they researchers, or did they become subjects in their own experiment? The evidence points increasingly toward the latter possibility. Consider the final known communication attributed to them: the telegram from Pittsburgh instructing mill operations to continue. This message, ostensibly from Elias Harper, arrived days after local authorities had already discovered whatever remained at the Harper property, after Sheriff Hayes had already consulted Dr. Westbrook and arranged for specimens to be transported to a federal facility. The timing suggests the telegram was not sent by Elias Harper at all, but by authorities seeking to establish a cover story for the brothers' absence while they contained the situation. The supposed sale to Allegheny Timber, a company that appears in no records before March 1923 and that seems to have existed solely to manage the Harper property, further supports this interpretation. In essence, the official narrative that the Harper brothers sold their business and relocated was fabricated to prevent any investigation into their actual fate, and their actual fate increasingly appears to have been that of subjects in their own final catastrophic experiment. This raises the most disturbing question of all. If the brothers did successfully transfer or transform their consciousness, even temporarily, what became of them afterward? The abandoned automobile suggests at least one of them survived the initial experiment, fleeing the property before authorities arrived. But the absence of bodies near the vehicle indicates they did not die there. Instead, they appear to have continued into the remote forests where, decades later, rangers and hunters would report unusual vocalizations and discover biological specimens defying conventional explanation. Forests now permanently restricted from public access under regulations that seem designed specifically to contain something rather than to protect natural resources. Could the Harper brothers, in some altered form, have survived for decades after their disappearance? The possibility seems fantastic, yet certain details support it. The preserved hand with its multiple DNA profiles. The tracks that local tracker Isaiah Miller claimed were made by something walking on more than 2 legs. The sounds described by Ranger Michael Donovan as attempts at human speech made by mouths not designed for speaking. Perhaps most compelling is a detail from the 1968 excavation of the chamber beneath the mill floor. According to the anonymous worker who spoke to the Bluefield Daily Telegraph, the metal strongbox recovered from beneath the chamber contained, among other items, a voice recording cylinder of the type used in early phonographs. The worker claimed to have overheard officials playing this recording before it was secured and transported away. What he described hearing defies easy explanation. It started with a normal man's voice, talking about some kind of procedure. Very technical, medical terms I didn't understand. Then the voice changed, not just the tone, but the way it formed words, like the mouth was changing shape while it was speaking. By the end, it wasn't a human voice at all, but it was still trying to speak English words, still had human thoughts behind it. That's what made it so terrible. You could tell it used to be a man. Was this the voice of Elias or Jeremiah Harper, recorded as they underwent some self-inflicted transformation? Did they document their own metamorphosis from human to something else entirely? If so, it suggests a fate more complex than simple death, a continuation of existence in an altered state, perhaps with fragmented consciousness or incomplete awareness. A state that authorities deemed too disturbing, too dangerous, to acknowledge publicly. This interpretation aligns with one final piece of evidence: a report filed by a state police officer who participated in the search around the abandoned automobile in October 1923. The report, filed but quickly classified, described finding a series of messages carved into trees leading away from the ravine. These messages, apparently created with a knife or similar tool, began as coherent English, but gradually degraded into irregular shapes that only vaguely resembled letters. The first message, clearly legible, read, "Still conscious." The second, "Body changing." The third, partially decipherable, "Memories fading." After that, the markings became increasingly abstract, though the officer noted they continued in a clear line heading northwest, toward the remote land the Harper brothers had acquired before their disappearance. What consciousness carved those messages? What creature, once human, documented its own transformation as it fled deeper into the Appalachian wilderness? And does some version of that consciousness persist to this day, nearly a century later, in the restricted forests of McDowell County? We may never know the full truth of what happened to the Harper brothers. The systematic erasure of records, the sealing of documents, the official silence, all have effectively obscured what might have been one of the most significant and disturbing scientific transgressions of the early 20th century. Yet, fragments remain. Contradictions in official narratives, unexplained phenomena in the forests north of Welch, the persistent unease that falls over long-time residents when certain topics arise. All suggest that something profound and disturbing occurred in those mountains, something entirely human in origin, yet ultimately transformative in ways that transcend our conventional understanding. The Harper brothers vanished from public record in March 1923. Their names were methodically erased from documents, their property transferred to a shell company, their very existence denied by those who had known them for decades. Yet their legacy persists in the silent forests of Appalachia, in restricted areas that remain off-limits a century later, in the lingering fear that keeps locals from venturing too deep into certain hollers after dark. Because some violations of natural law cannot be undone, some transformations, once initiated, continue in ways we cannot control or even comprehend. The Harper brothers may have discovered this too late, as their bodies changed around them, as their consciousness fragmented and reformed, in configurations never meant to exist. Their story serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked curiosity, of knowledge pursued without ethical constraints. It reminds us that the most profound horrors emerge not from supernatural forces, but from human minds willing to transgress fundamental boundaries in pursuit of forbidden knowledge. And somewhere in the remote forests of West Virginia, something that once was human may still wander, something that remembers being Elias or Jeremiah Harper, something trying to form words with organs not designed for human speech, something trying to make sense of fragmentary memories with a consciousness spread across altered neural structures, something that, in its more lucid moments, perhaps regrets the path that led it there. In 1973, 50 years after the Harper brothers' disappearance, an elderly man was admitted to a psychiatric facility in Huntington, West Virginia. The man, who identified himself only as Jay, claimed to have worked briefly at the Harper lumber mill as a young man. He had spent decades in Ohio, but had returned to West Virginia after recurring nightmares drove him to seek answers about what he had witnessed in 1923. According to the attending physician's notes, Jay had entered the restricted area north of Welch, determined to find evidence that would either confirm or disprove his suspicions about the Harper brothers' fate. What he found, or claimed to have found, was disturbing enough that the physician initially diagnosed him with delusional disorder. Patient claims to have encountered a colony of entities in a remote valley, the medical record states. Describes these entities as partly human, but mostly not. States they communicate through a combination of vocalizations and touch that puts thoughts directly in your head. Most disturbing is patient's claim that these entities identified themselves as Harper brothers and others who came after. Patient insists they are results of experiments involving mixing of people together that continue to this day. The physician recommended heavy sedation and transfer to a more secure facility. Before this could occur, however, the patient vanished from his room during the night. An orderly reported seeing an unmarked government vehicle in the parking lot around the time of the disappearance, but no official investigation followed. The patient's records were subsequently removed from hospital files, though the attending physician had maintained personal notes that emerged after his death. Was Jay suffering from delusions, or had he encountered something real, something authorities continue to conceal? Did he discover a hidden community of transformed beings originated by the Harper brothers' experiments and perpetuated through continued application of their techniques? And if so, who operates the federal facility mentioned in Sheriff Hayes's 1923 telegram? What agency monitors the restricted area and removes those who get too close to the truth? These questions remain unanswerable with available evidence, yet they suggest a disturbing possibility that the Harper brothers' work did not end with their disappearance but continued under government supervision. That what began as their private transgression evolved into an ongoing program of experimental biology conducted far from public view or ethical oversight. This possibility aligns with rumors that have circulated among certain scientific communities for decades, rumors of classified research into biological integration, consciousness mapping, and human modification. Research that supposedly began in the aftermath of World War I and continues in various forms to the present day. If such research exists, the Harper brothers may represent not an isolated case of scientific hubris, but patient zero in an ongoing program of human transformation. Their legacy may extend far beyond the restricted forests of McDowell County to classified facilities across the nation, where the boundaries between individual human beings and between humans and other species continue to be deliberately blurred in pursuit of knowledge and capability. This interpretation would explain the extraordinary measures taken to erase the Harper brothers from public record, not merely to cover up a disturbing incident, but to conceal the origins of a research program with profound national security implications. It would explain why documents related to the case remain classified nearly a century later, and why the restricted area in McDowell County continues to be closely monitored by federal authorities. But it raises troubling questions about what exists in that restricted area today. Are the entities allegedly encountered by Jay in 1973 still there? Do they represent the original results of the Harper brothers' experiments, somehow surviving for decades in isolation? Or are they more recent subjects, placed there by authorities continuing the brothers' work? In 1985, satellite imagery of McDowell County became briefly available through an academic research program before being reclassified. This imagery revealed something unusual in the restricted area. A series of structures arranged in a precise geometric pattern invisible from ground level due to the dense forest canopy. The structures appeared to be approximately 100 feet in diameter, connected by narrow pathways, with a larger central facility. When questioned, Forest Service officials claimed the structures were environmental monitoring stations. However, their layout, a perfect hexagon with additional structures at precise intervals, suggested a purpose more complex than environmental monitoring. Moreover, no public record of such an extensive monitoring system exists in Forest Service budgets or reports. What purpose do these structures serve? Who operates them? And what connection do they have to the Harper brothers and their century-old experiments? The answers may lie in the final piece of evidence to emerge in this disturbing case. A partial transcript of an interview conducted with Robert Kellerman, one of the 3 graduate students who abandoned their research in 1962 after accessing sealed records. The interview, conducted in 1998 as Kellerman neared the end of his life, was never published but circulated privately among researchers interested in the case. In this interview, Kellerman finally broke his decades-long silence about what he and his fellow students discovered in the state archives. His account, while fragmentary, suggests a scope far beyond what most investigators had imagined. What the Harper brothers did, it wasn't just about changing bodies. They believed consciousness was divisible, that it could be extracted, divided, and recombined across multiple physical vessels. Their notes described a successful transfer of consciousness between prepared subjects, but with an unexpected result. Rather than one consciousness replacing another, they merged, created a composite being with memories and aspects of both original subjects. According to Kellerman, the brothers' initial experiments involved animal subjects, primarily dogs and livestock. These experiments showed promising results but limited integration. The composite beings displayed behavioral traits from both source animals but lacked true consciousness integration. The brothers then progressed to human subjects. The records didn't specify where they obtained these subjects, Kellerman stated. But given the absence of missing persons reports from the region, I have to assume they came from elsewhere, possibly transients, possibly individuals provided by connections at the sanitarium. What's clear is that by early 1923, they had conducted at least 7 procedures involving human subjects. These procedures allegedly produced composite beings with varying degrees of consciousness integration. Some displayed little more than physical merging, remaining aware of their separate identities. Others achieved more complete integration, developing unified consciousness that incorporated aspects of both original subjects. But the brothers were not satisfied with these results. According to Kellerman's account of the sealed records, they believed true advancement would come only through what they termed multiple integration, the merging of 3 or more consciousness sources into a single composite entity. Their final experiment, based on the records we found, involved 5 subjects, including themselves, Kellerman stated. 3 individuals whose identities weren't specified, plus Elias and Jeremiah Harper. The procedure was scheduled for March 16, 1923, the last day anyone saw the brothers as their original selves. What happened during that procedure remains largely unknown. Kellerman indicated that the sealed records contained photographs of its aftermath, photographs so disturbing that Patricia Denning, one of his fellow researchers, destroyed her notes and refused to continue the investigation. These photographs reportedly showed a single entity incorporating physical aspects of multiple human subjects, still alive despite profound biological rearrangement. It was recognizable as the Harper brothers only in the vaguest sense, Kellerman stated. Facial features from both were present but distorted, integrated with elements from the other subjects. The overall form was, I still don't have words for it, not human, not anymore. But the eyes, God help me, the eyes showed awareness, multiple awarenesses, seemingly fighting for control. According to Kellerman's account of the sealed records, this composite entity escaped before authorities arrived, fleeing into the remote forests north of the Harper property. Subsequent communications between Sheriff Hayes and federal authorities detailed a search operation that continued for months, eventually locating the entity in the area now designated as restricted. Rather than destroying it, however, authorities allegedly contained it for study. The final documents we saw described the construction of a specialized facility in the forest, Kellerman stated, a place to house and study what the Harper brothers had created, but more than that, a place to continue their work under government supervision. The last report, dated December 1923, mentioned successful replication of the integration procedure with new subjects. If Kellerman's account is accurate, it suggests an extraordinary possibility, that what began as the Harper brothers' private experimental transgression evolved into a government-sanctioned research program. That the restricted area in McDowell County may house not only the original composite entity created in March 1923, but subsequent generations of similar experiments. This would explain the continued classification of all records related to the case, the ongoing restriction of the area, and the prompt removal of anyone who comes too close to discovering its secrets. It would explain why the story of the Harper brothers has been so thoroughly erased from public record, not merely to cover up a disturbing incident from 1923, but to conceal the origins of a continuing program of human consciousness integration. The implications are profound and disturbing. If such integration is possible, if human consciousness can be extracted, divided, and recombined, it represents a fundamental challenge to our understanding of individual identity. Are we truly indivisible, or could we be merged with others to create new composite entities? Could such technology be weaponized? Could it be applied to transfer consciousness beyond its original biological vessel, potentially achieving a form of immortality through continuous integration with new subjects? These questions extend far beyond the specific case of the Harper brothers. They touch on fundamental aspects of human identity, consciousness, and the ethical boundaries of scientific inquiry. They suggest possibilities both profound and terrifying, that consciousness might transcend individual physical forms, but at the cost of the very individuality that defines our humanity. For now, the full truth remains hidden in classified records, in restricted areas, in the institutional silence that has surrounded this case for nearly a century. But fragments continue to emerge, suggesting a reality more disturbing than most would care to contemplate. The Harper brothers vanished from public record in March 1923. Their names were methodically erased, their existence denied. Yet their legacy may continue in ways we are only beginning to understand, in composite entities still housed in secret facilities, in ongoing research programs exploring the divisibility of human consciousness, in the very question of what constitutes an individual human being. As Robert Kellerman concluded in his 1998 interview, the most terrifying aspect isn't what happened to the Harper brothers, it's that somewhere their work continues. Or has integration created something entirely new, something that transcends individual human identity in ways we can't even comprehend? Perhaps in the restricted forests of McDowell County, the answer walks on more than two legs, speaks with organs not designed for human speech, and views the world through eyes containing the integrated consciousness of what were once 5 separate human beings, including 2 brothers whose curiosity led them to become something no longer recognizably human. That somewhere composite entities exist, beings with multiple consciousness sources integrated into unified awareness. And the question that keeps me awake at night is, are they still individual people in there, aware of what they've become? Perhaps some questions truly are better left unasked, and some knowledge better left undiscovered.